Frequently, it's necessary to drain the coolant on the car for any number of reasons. To change radiator hoses or heater hoses sometimes, when you're changing the water pump, if you're fixing the vacuum pump, any number of things, thermostat change. So draining the radiator is very simple. All we need is a pan to catch the fluid. It holds 12 or 13 quarts, as I recall, something to that effect. We need a pan capable of holding a couple of gallons anyway. We won't get every drop out of it. When we drain the radiator, there'll be some antifreeze and water left in the block, but we'll at least drain most of it out of there. And then if you know what the plug looks like, it'll be a lot easier. This is inside the radiator, and it's on the very bottom of the radiator and one of the studs that holds it in place. And so from the bottom, what we're going to see is a screw. And all we're going to do is get under there and loosen that and drain the fluid right out of the radiator. It usually helps if we take the radiator cap off, because it's not trying to drain against, a vacuum. It's got a way to get air into it. All it'll take is a screwdriver. Screwdriver will fit right in that drain plug. So that's all we need, and it's not very tight. It's just a plastic plug, so be careful with it and don't break it. Let's go look at it. When I drain a radiator, I always put some newspaper down first underneath my pan, because the stuff splatters all over the place, and newspaper will absorb some of that excess. So let's just look. Right along the front of the car, at the bottom of the radiator, you can see there's a plug. Now, I said it was a Phillips, and just as sure as the world, it turns out to be a straight screwdriver. There's a couple of different variations on this plug, but you see it's right there. And so, it doesn't take much. Pan underneath it. It's got a little O-ring that seals it. And that's it. Just get out of the way. I usually hold my pan up there so it doesn't splatter all over the place. I always recommend that you do this when the water and engine is cool. My dad got a 3rd-degree burn one time opening a radiator that scalded him. That water is over the boiling point because it's under pressure. So when you have a hot automobile, the water can easily run 220, 250 degrees, up to about 250 degrees under pressure. And so you don't want to be messing with hot radiator water or hot engine water.
Go.
Okay. Now what we drained is the radiator and most of what's in the hoses and so forth. But there's some radiator antifreeze water, some coolant left still in the block. We didn't really drain that out. If you wanted to flush the system, now would be the way to do it. What you would do is run the car and just put a hose into the tank and run water through the system and let it drain out of here until it gets clear. And then you would have flushed all the old antifreeze out of it. Then you would put this drain plug back in there and of course add antifreeze and water. So that's really all there is to draining these radiators. Okay. There are any number of reasons to pull a radiator. The radiator could be bad and you need to replace it. If you have to change the water pump, you need to pull the radiator. If you need to rebuild a vacuum pump, at least on a 240D or a 300D, the vacuum pump is right there on the driver's side, and you need to pull the radiator in order to do that. So the radiator is a lot of time in the way. It only takes about 15 minutes to pull one out. So let's look at how we pull the radiator on a typical 123. Now, what we need for tools, not too much really. We need to separate the radiator from the oil cooler, at least on a diesel. On a diesel oil cooler on the driver's side of the car, all the 10mm socket and ratchet and extension. We've got a whole set of sockets here. I don't need that anymore, so that's what we use to separate the oil cooler. And then at the bottom of the radiator, there are transmission lines that connect to the bottom of the radiator. The transmission fluid is actually cooled by the radiator fluid, if you will, and may ask, well, how could that be? Well, radiator water is maybe 190 degrees and transmission fluid could be running over 300 if we don't try to cool it off. So in the bottom reservoir of the radiator, there's a coil, a copper coil or a steel coil tube that runs through there, and so it acts as a heat exchanger, and the transmission fluid is circulated through that. So we need to take those lines off, and we need a 19 millimeter open-ended grid sheet in order to do that. The rest of these tools are just a host of tools that I may need to take off the various hoses that are connected to the radiator. There are upper and lower radiator hoses connected, and then there's a filler hose that comes from the reservoir. And I've got both some Phillips and standard screwdrivers. Also, I just always take with me a little 1/4 inch drive set because sometimes those little screws that hold those clamps on are in awkward positions, and it makes sense to use a little ratchet in the 5/16, which is the equivalent of an 8 millimeter, which is what most of them are. So a 5/16 socket will fit the head on most of those screws that hold the clamps on these cars, if it's the original Mercedes clamp anyway. And so I just take a set of these with me under the car so that I can get those hoses off. So let's go see how to pull the radiator out.
Okay.
Most of the work to pull this radiator is underneath the car, and mostly we have the hoses underneath here, and I have all my tools with me, and this gets a little messy because usually there's a little water left in those hoses. I've already drained this radiator, so I'm going to start by disconnecting these two hoses over here on the passenger side, and I can see that I can get to that first clamp with just a regular screwdriver, I believe. And I want to stay out of the way because my experience is that there's always a little bit of coolant left in there, and it can be kind of a nasty job. You notice I've got newspaper underneath this whole thing to try to absorb some of the coolant that'll probably end up on the floor. So the first thing is to disconnect the hose, and even though I've drained this radiator, there's probably a little left in it. Might even get that pan. Didn't anticipate that there would be quite much in there. Let me see. Now I've got a pan underneath it. I didn't realize there would be quite that much. I knew there'd be some left. Let's see how much I've got left in there. And you see, I need to flush this system. I will. Well, we'll take care of that clamp later. So you got that clamp off. Now the other one, I can see that's in a nasty spot. It's on this hose right here, and that's the filler hose from the reservoir. And I know these things are an 8 millimeter, which is equivalent to like a 5/16. Okay. So now I got my 5/16 and a ratchet. This one, as I say, is in kind of a nasty spot. Depends on how they put those clamps on there, but got it loose. Now we've got the two water hoses off of it. Now you can see there are two coolant lines from the transmission. It takes a 19 millimeter open-ended wrench. These things are going to drip a little transmission fluid, but that's okay. It probably won't even drip more than 2 or 3 ounces. Again, that's why I put the newspaper underneath it. There's that one, and let's see how tight this one is. There we go. So we'll take those off. Okay. Well, now that I've got these transmission lines loose, before I really disconnect them and have them start dripping, let me just go over here with this 10 millimeter. Right on the bottom of this oil cooler near the radiator, you can see a little 10 millimeter bolt. And we're going to take that bolt all the way out of there. It holds a little clamp that secures the oil cooler to the radiator. And it'll become obvious once we get it off. And usually once I get it loose, I can take it off of there with my hand, and you can see we're just going to take it all the way out of there, set it down underneath, and that's going to enable us to pull that oil cooler or leave that oil cooler and pull the radiator right out. Now let's go ahead and finish with our oil cooler lines, and as I said, we're going to drip a little fluid, but it's okay. It probably amount to less than a couple of ounces before we're done. Okay, now we're finished underneath here. Now we just need to go on top and disconnect the hoses, and we'll be ready to pull it out. So let's go on top. So the top bolt on the oil cooler is the same way. It's 10 millimeter, and it's right next to the hose that connects to the top of the radiator. So we need to take that bolt out of there too, and we need to take it all the way out. And that's it. So you can see this clamp will come right off. Now you can see now that I've got it apart, it just goes through there, and that's what clamps the oil cooler to the radiator. It's a lot easier to leave the oil cooler in the car. We could disconnect the oil cooler and leave the oil cooler attached to the radiator, but that is a messy proposition because you're going to get nasty old motor oil all over the place. We're much better off just disconnecting the oil cooler. Now the only thing really left to disconnect up here of any consequence are the radiator hose, the top radiator hose, and then this, which is the overflow hose. And with both of them, or with each of them, all we need is a screwdriver. So you just take that clamp off and disconnect that hose. So that hose is off, and then I can see I need a Phillips. A Phillips to take off this little guy, little clamp. Usually, sometimes I need to pry these things off. So that's disconnected, and then the balance of it is pretty easy. There are 4 clamps, 2 that hold the shroud inside which the fan runs, and then 2 clamps, one here and one here, that actually pin the radiator to the car. So usually I just take a screwdriver, put underneath those clamps, pry them off, and then the shroud just moves back. There are some plastic tabs that hold it into the bottom of the radiator. We just move it up a little bit and back it away. And then we're going to pull the radiator. There's a rubber insulation kind of a thing there. I usually just stick a screwdriver under there and pull it off. You can see that clamp comes right off. Let's set it up there on the air cleaner. And the same is true, hopefully, of this one. Won't be stubborn on us. So then we pull that clamp off, and now we're ready to lift that radiator out. Have to maybe juggle this around because sometimes that bottom clamp is still stuck. I need to get underneath there, and I'll show you what's holding it. Is this little clamp. I took that bolt out, but I didn't get that clamp all the way off of there. We don't need to film that, but I'm going to go underneath there and take that clamp off right quick. Okay, now I got everything. Got that bottom clamp off, and you can see the radiator just lifts right out of there. The fan shroud is still in there. Now, we want to be careful and kind of keep it tilted with the top end back so that we don't drain any more fluid than we need to out of these transmission connections. If we tilt it up a little bit, you can see that the plug is right there on the radiator. It's actually on that stud, if you will, that plastic stud. So there's 2 studs that pin down into the frame, and that's what holds the radiator on the bottom. And of course on the top, those 2 clamps are what's holding that radiator. Now, Mercedes radiator, the tanks are plastic, And they're actually crimped connections along the top and the bottom. So both the bottom and the top tank are plastic tanks, and that's good that they don't rust out, but because they're not soldered, they really can't be recrimped. Or, well, I guess there's some shops that attempt to recrimp them, but for the most part, you'd need to buy a new radiator. That's my advice whenever these radiators go bad. They last so long that you don't have to replace them very often. So that's how to pull a radiator. Hi, Gordon. This morning we're going to look at a bare radiator and one of the seepage problems with them. The little overflow tube on them, quite frequently, it breaks, it cracks and breaks, just from age, we suppose, of the plastic. But you'll notice that, you can tell, notice the seepage around the radiator. And it's not the hose. It could be the hose. I mean, make sure your hose is tight, but if you've tightened up this hose around this little barb that comes out of the radiator for overflow and it still leaks, what happens to them is they crack. They crack, they get kind of rotten, the plastic does, and eventually they'll break. And rather than we replace the whole radiator, which is like a $350 job, we've devised a little technique where you can save the radiator and not have to have that expense, and at the same time you don't even have to remove the radiator to do the repair. We sell a little kit. Essentially it's a nipple that we put in there, and what we do is tap out that hole, and then we've got all the right sizes, and we have a little kit for about $25 where you tap the hole out, you drill a hole out, and then tap it out. And after you tap it, you put a little brass nipple in there, but you have to JB weld it to get a real good seal. But it really does work well, and it saves you the expense of a radiator and also the trouble to pull one out. So we'll show you how we do that. Now the parts we use to make this repair are a brass nipple. You can buy it from an Ace Hardware. It's a 5/16, that's the size of the barb, 5/16 of an inch, by 1/8 pipe. It's called 1/8 pipe. That's the thing that'll fit in that hole once we drill it out. So we're going to drill the hole out and tap it, and of course we're going to tap it to a 1/8 pipe. And we just bought this this 1/8 pipe tap at just a local hardware store too. And what we're going to need is, it says either a 21/64 drill or a 5/16 drill, and that's only off by 1/64 of an inch. You could use either one. If you got a 21/64, it's probably a little better. So anyway, you need to drill the hole out and then run a tap through there, and then we're going to screw this in there. And we use JB Weld. We love this stuff, so we just mix up a little bit of this epoxy and put on the threads, and then we'll put it on the outside too and let it dry for a while. It takes really about a day to set up, so you need to do this sometime in the evening after things cool off, and let it at least harden overnight. If it hardens overnight, that's good enough to drive it the next day, and then it finally cures in about 24 hours. Here's one of the broken off nipples. The little barb, you see the plastic breaks around there. It finally ages, cracks, and breaks, and you don't want to sacrifice the whole radiator for that little thing, so this is our little cheap fix for it. Now, it's going to be hard for the camera to see it, but you can see the seepage all around this one, and it's cracked right in there. If I do that, I don't think you can see the crack, but it's cracked, and that's what's causing our leak. So what we need to do is drill that out and tap it and put our little fix in there. I've got a 21/64 drill. I happen to have one, but again, a 5/16 would work. And that thing is seeping, and I just cut it off, and I'm going to drill it out. And I don't have a very good start there. Okay, so now we've got that drilled out. No sense opening that. We might sell that, right? much. But sufficient. Now what I've got is a 10mm socket on this particular tap, this 1/8 pipe tap. It turns out that the socket it fits, so if I get an extension back here, it just makes it a lot easier to run a tap in it that way. Now a 1/8 pipe is convenient thread because it's tapered in it. And of course the reason we're using it is because that's what the brass nipple is. But nonetheless, it's a good thing. We're going to put JB weld all over this thing. One of the places is on the threads, and then we're also going to put it around the base of the joint, just to get a good seal. Okay, so screw that in there, and then we'll JB weld all around. It does get tight because it's tapered, but even though it does get tight, we want to back it up because it's just plastic. We back it up with some JB weld all around that joint. You can see that it does get tight. But it would be pretty easy to strip it out, so just be careful that you don't do it all the way till it strips. So you got to get the JB weld all around it, and then you're going to have to let it dry for overnight. But just coat it real well. It won't hurt to get a little extra on it, and that'll fix it.